Welcome along, Amanda. It's great to have you, and thanks for taking the time to have a chat with me.
You're really welcome.
Well, I think it's really important for everyone to be able to get a sense of ethics and its role in business. Mm-hmm. And I know that QUT works pretty hard to try and integrate ethics through everything we do, not just in this subject. I mean, we do some frameworks and set a little bit of groundwork.
Sure.
So I'd just be interested in your view. Why do you think ethics is an important element of a business education?
I think it's really fundamental in a business education. We have seen in the last, 2 decades, some real challenges with ethics. And of course, in the global financial crisis, businesses were held out to be the big bad. In the reason that the world went belly up was because we had businesses that were just grabbing for cash and doing all that they could to maximize profits for shareholders and not really care about what value they were contributing. And that's a problem. I don't think our programs have ever been like that. We've never focused exclusively on profit, because obviously organisations and businesses are providing a whole range of values to the community, to the environment, to global prosperity, to the development of human capital, social capital. So there's many more things that businesses do. But I think it's really important that we remember our why and the purpose of our business. And underpinning that, of course, is values and ethics and a moral compass that helps to provide insight into a strategy and insight into why that business operates and whether it should operate. Yeah. There are some arguments that some businesses perhaps shouldn't exist. We look at businesses like big tobacco. That's often one that becomes a real question for its value.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's really interesting. One of the things that you kind of piqued in my memory is not many people actually know that my first degree was in economics.
Yeah.
And so the moral philosopher Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, the Far was a moral philosopher. Yeah. Economics has its roots within it. And very interestingly, both he and even Friedman, the poster boy of profit, the role of business is to make money, always said that the role of business is to make money within the rules of the game.
Yeah.
And they would include, there's some argument with Friedman about whether that included social values beyond the legal, but at the very least, they always included the legal boundaries of the game.
Yeah.
And the argument from people like Smith was always, he actually had a great quote at one time, which was something like, beware and it was the sexist language of the time, beware the man who believes they can move people around like pieces on a chessboard.
Yeah.
People are better at making their own decisions in these things. So I think it's deeply rooted. Moral philosophy is deeply rooted, is deeply put in business, and things get twisted. Yep. Often in the media, and you watch greed is good, and self-interest works. What alignment of interest.
Yes.
And I really liked your tobacco example about suggesting what value does it create, particularly a product.
Yeah.
Which there's maybe there's an argument there's some value in the product, but there's a lot of argument there that a lot of the products there were built about. And I personally, I wonder around things like social media at the moment.
Yeah.
Which is almost like the crack of your attention.
Yeah, exactly. And what value is it creating? Now, if it's creating value that helps to, so if you take the social media example, and is it creating value by helping to highlight challenges, inequities, raising social concerns and giving voice to those who perhaps don't have a voice. I could perhaps see some value in that. Although I think that there is a lot of it that is almost really self-interesting capitalism personified in the social media.
I'm a little more cynical. They want your eyeballs and whatever you click. Yeah. It's a fascinating time. We're probably going to get sued for that.
Well, I think we have a freedom of expression. We do that. It almost is our ethical underpinning and our moral philosophy in that in the educational environment. And one of the things that's important for us as educators in business is that we share that, and that we're not afraid that we put our moral philosophies forward, and that we encourage our students to actually think about their why and their purpose. And if they're in this business, why are they in this business? What value creation are they generating? And how are they generating it? And I think they're really important questions for our students to grapple with.
What you've really done there too, what I really like about what you did there, was you actually captured two of the core ethical frameworks that we deal with in the subject, right? On the one hand, you're saying, what value they create. Yeah. So you're looking at the outcome. Yeah. Overall, do we create value or do we not? Then on the other though, how do you create it?
How do you create it?
Right? Is it enough just to create value and you don't care how you do it? Is it enough just to be good about the way you do it without creating any value, right? And reconciling that tension, is a huge kind of issue, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely is. And, I think it also is important that for students who are, moving out into businesses to be able to identify where they want to be. So what sort of value do you want to create, and where are you going to be able to do that? I think if you can identify that helps you to along your career path in some ways. I found that myself. I moved from agricultural machinery or agriculture into higher education. So my first area was in HR in agriculture industry. And, you would think that food production is actually an area that is highly valued for, the human population and something that you wouldn't have much of a problem with ethical dilemmas. And yet, ethical challenges in agriculture are, really substantial. You've got one particular area that we grappled with the organisation that I worked with, for instance, was, I don't know if I should be able to say, it's a farming area that grew cotton. Yep. So I won't name names, but, the actual case was one where they were storing water, and they're storing water from the Murray-Darling Basin, and so they were holding water up river from the Murray, and it couldn't travel. The water couldn't travel downriver, and downstream, of course. Yep. People had water licenses and they were creating other livelihoods from it, but the natural environment was dying. Yeah. Because of the agricultural environment. So, and that was a real tension. Like, so individual farms might have been doing okay, but overall, the entire ecosystem was failing. And so the value creation from the individual properties arguably was within the legal frameworks and all above board and according to law, and no one was doing anything arguably incorrect or wrong or
illegal
or illegal. I mean, it was all happening according to all of the regulations that were in play, but the ecosystem was dying. So something was really wrong with that.
It's really interesting. I think in the Economist in me was to talk about the negative externality of that system, right? Yeah. So when you get the pricing mechanism wrong, when you get the rules of the game wrong, when you get the law wrong, the system doesn't work well. Yeah. And there's huge arguments about that at the moment with all forms of the environment, don't they? One of the interesting things that we deal with is this idea of ethical relativity. So juxtaposing, is there something that is like ethical or not?
Yeah.
Or does it depend? Does it depend? So can ethics vary by culture? And one of the things we talk about is that it's quite difficult. If you believe in relativity, then how do you judge anyone else's action, right? Unless you have some absolute level versus well, it allows people a diversity of view. And we talk some ways of reconciling that. Yeah. So one of the interesting questions that I have for you out of that example is my understanding is that countries very rarely care about the environment until GDP reaches at least 5,000 US a year per person, right? And the wealthier you are, the more value people place on the environment. Yeah. So I think the latest stat was that there's more wildlife or wild areas and greenery in the UK than when they wrote the Doomsday Book in 1066, right? Yeah. So if you actually look at then the reforestation of Europe, etc., as an example. So what are your thoughts about things like CSR and the environment variations? Because we were dealing today, for instance, in one of our examples of child labour, where it's easy for us to say no, but if you're a destitute family, and that's how you pay the school fees or that's how you get food for the family, what are your thoughts?
Oh, look, I really think this is a interesting area, and it is culturally bound, and I absolutely agree that as when you benefit from being in an environment where you can philosophize over how you engage with the world, and in arguably the developed economies can do that, and so we can sit around and we can create arguments about what we believe is morally appropriate for organisations, for the environment, for the people in the environment, for our entire culture, versus when you're in a developing nation and you're struggling just to create basic health, food, and economies. They are very different comparisons.
I mean, that's the really interesting. The first time it was raised with me was about a guy who I did work with, great guy who worked up in the Papua New Guinea highlands, right, with mining. Yeah. And there's a lot of negative press about the mining companies and things that they've done terribly wrong up there. And I remember one time he talked to me and said, but what gives you the right to tell these villagers that they can't get an income stream to send their kids to school and to do all this stuff, And so I think that's where that balance you talked about of how to do it, that you don't destroy everything as you're doing it as well as
exactly. And if we really believe in, say, for instance, the UN Sustainability Development Goals, which is arguably what they've been created to help all economies move forward in a balanced way. If we really, as developed economies, believe in those goals, then it's our responsibility to help, to support, to work with other economies in order to bring them along. That rarely happens, however, I think. Businesses will look for, how they're creating value. And is there value being created by working with developing economies to help them manage their local resources, their natural resources, their human capital, and to be able to raise the prosperity of their nations? Are we doing that? Our governments provide aid and support and those sorts of things, but are our businesses doing that? I don't know. I think that's a very, very big question.
Michael Porter writes a lot of stuff on that around getting shared value out of things, because I think that's a critical element. You've got to capture enough value to be sustainable as a business that you can generate a lot.
Where you can generate that.
So a lot of the guys are probably sitting there thinking, that's all well and good, but I'm not going to run a company and I'm not really going to be involved in those kind of decisions. So I was wondering if you had kind of an example from your life of an ethical dilemma that you think you face in this. And I'm quite open with the guys in class that I do things that I'm not proud of.
Yeah.
You know, like that's, if I look back, I would not have done that.
Yeah.
And why did I do that? And, you know, that's a core element. So I suppose I'm just trying to open the way to say whether you say positive or negative.
Yeah.
You know, we always present ourselves away, but personally, it's some terrible mistakes when I think about it.
Well, you know what? I think to err is human, though, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, people make mistakes, and one of the interesting things about ethical dilemmas, though, is there are decisions. They are decisions you're making at a time based upon the knowledge that you have at the time, and you know, often post a decision or post hoc, you can reflect back and go, oh, well, actually, now that I know what I know, maybe I wouldn't have gone down that path. Working where I used to work, I've worked in HR most of my life, and a lot of the decisions that we've had to make, you know, are based upon the legal frameworks that we've been given from the employee relations area, and then balanced with what's going to, you know, be appropriate for the individual and their circumstances. And, you know, I think that there have been numbers of times that the decisions have been poor, and that if I reflect upon them, it could have been a lot more effective. HR is a you know, it gets awfully messy because you've got people and emotions that also become a part of it, and particularly when we're starting to talk about change processes, and certainly we've been through some change processes in the organisations that I've worked in previously, but also at QT. We've been through a number of change processes that I've been, you know, responsible for part of, but not responsible for the whole thing. And so you've got a little bit of an insight into one part of it, and there are ways in which they've been handled that I'm not been proud of. Yeah. That I, if reflecting back, would have done things very differently. And I'm talking about, you know, people losing their jobs, you know, saying that we're going to go through a change process and all the jobs that are existing now are going to be removed, and people need to reapply for positions. And it sounds, you know, harking back to the Friedman, like, you know, moving people around on a chessboard. It sounds like that's a legitimate thing for a business to do. It's a legitimate activity for an organisation to decide on what types of roles are important to create the value that organisation is trying to create. But you're creating it through human capital. These are people that depend on livelihoods. They have families and mortgages and, you know, bills to pay, and you're just going, your job's gone. Yeah. Now there's these jobs available. You can reapply for them if you like. Yeah.
I mean, it's a fascinating issue. I think just not HR, but lots of areas of business. It's like life. We can kid ourselves with impression management. Like I even went through and said we presented the best view of ourselves. Like you ask most people to choose an ethical dilemma. They're going to choose the one that they did right. Like, they're not going to tell you their dirty laundry till you really get to know them. And it's like that with all areas of business. Like my reflection on HR is the two biggest things, ethical, not the two biggest, but two things that come back to me over and over. And I spent a lot of time consulting where those kind of decisions were made at the C-suite level, etc. And the first one was, there are so many people who avoid making a hard decision. Yeah. And they kid themselves that they don't need to make the hard decision. Yeah. You know? Yeah. Right? Just bite the bullet. Yeah. And I think, to me, if I could have learned years ago, make the hard decision. Don't dodge. Yeah. I'll put my hand up. Still suffer. Yeah. Still suffer from not doing that nearly enough. But and in not making the hard decision, you make it worse for everyone. Yeah. Yeah. And we kid ourselves. You know, like it may be a legitimate business issue that those jobs can't be supported anymore. If that's a decision, let's not kid ourselves though that there's a chance they can have another decision, another position. You know, that to me is the secondary element of a lot of areas of business pretend
Yeah.
to be doing something that they're not doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they think people will buy it and they'll get less resistance and things. Have you seen that at all?
Look, I've seen that. It's hard.
Anyway, I'm not trying to.
It's hard to talk about your current employer, isn't it? But I've certainly seen that. I've got a interesting story from before I came to higher ed. Like we're going through a lot of change in higher ed right now, obviously, and there's so much to still unpack. But an area that I worked in agriculture, it was farmers were giving up land on the coast because the canal developments were big business, and trying to convince themselves that it was okay to provide their land for development because it was going to generate housing and whatnot, and so
local economy.
Generate housing versus a generation of food. It wasn't as if the land was in its natural state. It wasn't wasn't there for environmental purposes and so on. But parts of the land may have been quite natural still. In particular, one of the areas that we worked on were mangroves.
Yeah.
And back then, you could still dig up a mangrove. It was okay. Like you could get council approval to dig big holes in mangroves where now any ecologist would tell you that would be the most fundamental mistake, and things have changed. But creating that sense of, no, but it's okay because what we're doing here is we're not going to use it for this purpose, but we're going to use it now for this purpose, and this purpose has greater longevity and is creating more value, and convincing yourself that that's actually an okay move, and then reflecting back on that, 10 years later you go, really? Yeah. How do we convince ourselves that was an okay move then?
Well, I think, and I think it's really interesting that I think one of the things that we sometimes talk about is the idea about people's preferences.
Yeah.
And how those preferences change. I think the preferences change with wealth.
Yeah.
If you can't, what was it? Is it Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Am I right there with my HR?
Right. You are very absolutely. You don't self-actualize. Self-actualization is actually at the very top of the pyramid. At the bottom is just basic food, shelter, safety is the fundamental, foundation. And then as you progress up the hierarchy, you begin to think about different priorities.
Absolutely, and that's and it's really fascinating that we talk about so when there were a lot more mangroves, the marginal value of any piece of mangrove, and then and maybe we didn't understand them, so there's a lack of knowledge in the system, and there's these multiple factors, and I think sometimes we can look back on what occurred, and go, gee, how wrong was that? I'm probably the last one who should be discussing this, but we had a discussion in class today. One of the students brought up, we're looking for ethical dilemmas, and students brought up the issue of paying women less than men. And I said, well, okay, but let's go back in time to when that occurred, because that definitely occurred. Same job, pay men more than women. But why? Why would people make that rule? And then you look at, what was the structure of society? Most women were at home in the home. The husband would be out working. They needed money to support the family. Society makes a judgment that it's okay to pay more because of that difference. As that changes, World War II, different rights for grouping, and now it's not acceptable. And that changes. So it's really interesting. And that's one of the things we talk about in relativity. What we talk about is, are we really seeing a different ethic across cultures, or is it just the different expression of a culture? And I think it's really important for students to think about that. because looking after people might look a lot different with different constraints,
with a different cultural lens. Yeah,
and it's even not the cultural. It could be the environmental. It could be how economic developed. Your first thing is to get food and shelter to everyone.
Yeah, that's right.
That's how we judge society's interest. So what in terms of those kind of ethical dilemmas, have you had a personal one that you feel maybe I would have done differently that you feel like sharing or not? I understand if you don't, and I'll edit it out. But
no, I'm more than happy to share.
I can think of one.
Yeah.
One of the ones that still amazes me, and I'm always amazed by this.
Yeah.
When I first came to QUT, I got asked to do a review of a certain organisational unit.
Right.
I won't go into too many things. And I'd only been here for a year or two. So this is years ago. I feel comfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
And look, I was as conflicted as hell.
Yeah.
Right? When I look back on that, I work at QUT. You're asking me to do this, to chair this panel of this independent group. And I don't know how I convinced myself. I think it was a combination of being asked by a senior person at the university to do it, so I didn't want to say no. Getting money. Yeah. There were a whole lot of things there.
Yeah.
But I went into that, and and the amount of ulcers and sleepless nights and, I would never do that again. Yeah. And it was so obvious. For someone in my area, like corporate governance, like, how the fuck did I get here? But I see that over and over again in my area, that people just don't see it coming.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing about this subject, like making you aware. You don't even see it's an ethical dilemma because you're so embedded in the decision. Yeah. And that, I always think back about that. Oh, dude, how did I end up there?
Well, I have one that is in this in my role in this organisation, well, not my current role, but as an academic in this organisation, in a similar way. I accepted being on a supervision panel for a PhD student, which I thought the candidate was, perhaps not quite at the standard that they should have been.
I feel your pain.
But I was happy to support and help to coach and guide this person through. And you go after, and I'm talking years, like you're to persist in supporting somebody and helping them grow, and I really believe in human growth, and that's the HR person in me, the psych coming out, everybody can grow and develop. And it gets to a point where how much of the work is yours versus the student, where do you stop? And once you get so far and so deep into that process, and I kept going, even though, and I kept reviewing, and I kept rewriting, and I kept doing things, and it got to the point where myself and the other supervisor were like, I think we've crossed the line. Like, I think we've gone past the point of this being this person's work versus our work. Yeah. And yet this person's going to graduate with the highest degree. Yeah. If they make it through, what have we done? Have we actually crossed the line? Where is the line? It gets to a point where you start to not know where that ethical dilemma began until you're too far through it.
Absolutely.
In some ways.
Absolutely. That's a great example. What I really like about that is, I think when you step back, most ethical dilemmas are exactly like the frog in the slowly boiling water. Yeah. You don't start out doing something that's totally illegal and unethical, right? Yeah. Even in all these organisations, it's just this slippery slope that you just start on, often with good motives, right? Yeah. And then before you know it, you're doing something which...
And then you're scratching your head and going, hang on a minute.
There's a whole lot of things, but actually wrapped up in that. And that's, I think, one of the things for people to think about is, what are the limits that they set themselves around certain things, so that you know where the line is for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And I certainly learned from that experience. And then when I was asked to take on somebody, that was quite some years ago, when I was asked to take on somebody that I felt was in a similar, it was a similar sort of level of capability, I said no.
Yeah.
I just said, no, look, I can't actually, participate. And I so I wouldn't agree to the supervision. But if I I did have in my head where the limits were. Like, this is what needs to be demonstrated here, and if it can't be demonstrated here, then it's time to call it quits.
I reckon that's a great insight too, because that's kind of what I was talking about making the hard decision.
Yeah.
In many ways, it's easier to keep helping.
Yeah.
It's less confrontational. Yeah. It's less, and with some of the students, like if it's an international student, you're talking huge personal ramifications.
Yeah. And there were cultural differences and differences based upon respect and work ethics and so on, which were all really positive in the experience that I had.
But if you can't do it,
then it gets to a point was like, where what's my responsibility here? Where should I have pulled it up and stopped? And and it was only upon reflection, when you're right in deep, that you go, oh, look, you know what? 2 years ago I should have pulled this back and said, here was the line. But I just didn't see it. But now that I've had that experience, I can overlay that onto any potential situations that might be similar. But it's hard until you've had the experience, I think. It
is. And most of us don't like confrontation and conflict, you know. And that's a difficult thing too, because we don't like it. What's the latest internet meme that you go, Karen? But that's the whole thing, right? Because you don't like conflict, so the way people, they can't engage constructively. They start shouting at people rather than engaging and seeing their view and saying, okay, I get that, I don't agree, but
exactly,
that's about it. So would you have any kind of final tips for people around ethics and the approach, their approach to it in life?
Look, I guess that I was just going to say something funny about the Courier Mail and
about the success of our subject.
I always used to say to people who I'm working with, if you're okay with it being on the front page of the Courier Mail, it's good. It's like it's always the Courier Mail test for me. But
I am reminded of the Warren Buffett though. He wrote in a letter to shareholders once. What is it? We employ however many thousands of people they employ. You can be sure that somewhere someone is doing something wrong.
Exactly. and I think that we're human, and humans are fallible, and it's. I'd rather actually people be fallible and put their hand up and say, you know what, I screwed up, I did this, or I missed that, because I've certainly made my share of mistakes, and I expect that all the people that I work with are likely to have had the same experiences. But I'd rather people just come clean with that and say, look, or we've gone down this path and I don't think that's right. I think we should back away from it now. We should be doing something different. We should own that and then change, because here is the dilemma we're now faced with. Because as you say, you don't always see things up front. But for me, my advice to people is to really get in touch with your own values, your own moral compass, where you see your own purpose, and aligning that with the organisation you want to work with, and using that to help drive your how as well. I think that's really important. Knowing what's really valuable for you, and using that to align where you want to work. That's why I'm working where I'm working, because I totally, absolutely believe in human capability development. That's my fundamental drive. I believe in growth. And in an educational institution, it can facilitate growth. What you can get stuck with, of course, is like what I did in wanting to facilitate growth, going to the point where it was now, is it the person's growth, or are you just, are you doing it?
What was I heard it someone say, which I thought is this, there's a real truth when you say it, when you listen to it, but about kids, like once you have kids, right? But it was, if you want to help your kids as much as possible, do as little for them as possible as you possibly can.
Exactly. Like you've got to, the individual needs to demonstrate their growth.
So guys, that's you. You've got to study the subject, right?
Exactly. We can't learn for you.
But I think that's great advice. And I really want to thank you for taking the time, because I know how valuable it is. So I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. No,
thanks very much.
It's been great. Thank you.
No problem.
Enjoy.